it being 10:31, we may as well get underway. Good morning. Welcome to PHP is almost here. Panic. My name is Adam Harvey. I work on PHP. I work on the PHP documentation. In the rare occasions I actually, do the work I'm paid for. I work for a company called New Relic. We do software performance stuff. That is the end of the plug, and everything I say from here is not endorsed by them. You can also find me on Twitter at @lgnome. So feel free to tweet live feedback, and I will do my best to ignore it if it pops up on my screen. So obviously I'm here to talk about PHP 7. I'm not really going to rehash Zev's keynote from yesterday because I'm sure that 95% of us were there, so I'm not going to go into any great detail. What I am going to say is it is faster, as we know. Never trust a benchmark you didn't fake yourself, so I did this yesterday. And this is the time in seconds to build the PHP manual, which is a very heavy process where basically it processes this gigantic, 20, 30 meg XML file and spits out about 11,000 files out the other end. So this is very I/O bound, but you can see even an I/O bound thing is still way, way quicker than it was back in PHP 5.3. And of course, it's better. There have been 43 RFCs. I think there's actually a few more than that. I was just counting the bullet points on the wiki under implemented in PHP 7, which is a terrible metric because not everybody actually remembers to move them there. As of 2 days ago, there were 9,054 commits. I tried to exclude merge commits, so that's probably actual commits. That is quite a lot. So there's a lot of stuff in PHP 7, and there's a lot of shiny stuff, and I'm going to talk about basically none of it, unless the talk comes in at 20 minutes, in which case I'll start singing and dancing. You don't need to be able to read this. This is just for me to hand wave at. So if that's the carrot, there's all this awesome new stuff. Here's the stick. PHP is used a lot, and more specifically PHP 5 is used a lot. It's really popular. It's 5th on the list of languages on GitHub in terms of number of repositories per language. There are 138,000 PHP repositories on GitHub right now. That is behind only JavaScript, Java, Python, and CSS. And it's actually ahead of Ruby and so these tiny languages called C. Never heard of it. And of course, that's only the tip of the iceberg. Never mind that there's 140,000 projects. Think about how many sites there are. There are millions. There are tens of millions. There are companies out there whose entire business plan is based around trying to figure out how many tens of millions of websites there are running PHP versus, tens of millions of websites running Ruby versus, hundreds of websites running on Bash. So if there's that many sites, think about how much PHP 5 code this actually is. There's probably billions of lines of PHP 5 code deployed out there. So what that means, of course, is that everybody's really tied to PHP 5. And therefore, moving to PHP 7 means that you have to be aware of what's going to break between PHP 5 and PHP 7. There is, of course, another problem as well. And you can tell I did this 2 days ago because it says the 19th, which is that PHP 5.6 is not actually very long for this world. On the support calendar on our website, you can see that, we are already in the prime support period for the last version of PHP 5. This extends to August 28, 2017. That means PHP 5.6 is end of life on August 28, 2017, and that's completely end of life. Like, that's not just we're not going to fix bugs, that is we're not going to fix security issues. The next time somebody comes up with a snappy web page with a logo and lots of marketing verbiage and doesn't tell you what the vulnerability is in PHP 5 after that date, then it's actually going to be a problem. What it really means, of course, is that any version of PHP that's not version 7 will be end of life on August 28, 2017, which really isn't that far away. It's actually pretty close. So what do we do? Well, we can panic. That is, of course, in the title of the talk. If anybody wants to flail, please go ahead. Try to go into the corridor so you don't flail against people around you. Or we can try to not panic, because it turns out it's really not that bad. Anytime a language or a major project implements a major version number, I think it's fair to say that users of that project are going to be a little bit scared of migrating their code, right? I mean, it's happened to all of us. We've all been burned by stuff. PHP 4 to 5 was kind of hard. Symfony 1 to 2 turned out to just totally rewrite it. So what do? How do you manage this? Well, I can see three options. One, you can stick your head in the sand and pretend it's all going to be okay. You can just rely on distribution packages to buy you a few more years. I mean, Ubuntu 14.04 is going to be supported until April 2019. Red Hat 7, CentOS 7 are going to be supported until 2024 if you want to run an already ancient version of PHP in 5.4. Of course, you could also think about where you were in 2006 and think about where you are today and maybe consider whether you really still want to be running the same code on the same programming language and the same version in 9 years, because thinking about the code I was writing 9 years ago, I sure as hell don't. But hey, it's an option. Option 2 is you can have a flag day. You can just change over, you can just say, okay, on Tuesday we're running PHP 5, on Wednesday at 9 AM we're going to do a deploy and we're running PHP 7. If all you manage is like just a single website, maybe it's small enough that you don't really have a testing or development infrastructure, Sebastian's there and looks horrified, but I know people do in practice. Maybe that's actually a decent option. If nobody's relying on you besides actually just keeping the site up, then hey, maybe that's an option for you. But if you're an upstream project, like if you maintain a library, and with the advent of Composer and Packagist, a lot more of us maintain libraries than we used to. If it's a library, if you maintain a framework, if you just work on a library or a framework, that's not really an option. At that point you're just saying, hey, as of Wednesday, we don't support you guys still running on PHP 5. Haha, doesn't really work. So I think the best option for most is, you can dual wield PHP 5 and 7. You can have your code run on both for a reasonable changeover period. If you're a website, it may be that your changeover period might be pretty small, but have it run on both for a bit. It may actually help you find some bugs, which is always a bonus. And then you can then have a phased policy. So I've shown this a couple of times before at conferences. This is Adam's incredibly unscientific theory on backward compatibility. So when you move to a new backward incompatible version of something, you basically have the old stuff that you broke, the new stuff that is awesome and shiny but you can't use if you're having to run the same code on multiple platforms. And in the middle is what you actually get to use, particularly if you maintain libraries and you're trying to dual wield. You have this subset of both languages, which you hope intersects, and that's basically all you can write your code in. Now, what you hope is that the person or people who have developed your language or developed your library or whatever it is that you're dealing with have maximized that surface area. So you don't want to be limited to this tiny little subset where all you can do is add and subtract. That theoretically it's probably Turing complete, but that's not going to make it fun to develop in. You're probably going to go find something else to do. So what you try and do is you maximize this. Now, this is dangerous if you're a language developer, because you've got to be very careful to maximize this, because it's very seductive to break all the things, right? We had plenty of proposals on internals for, hey, the array functions suck. We should really give them a consistent API. Well, they do suck. Like, everybody knows it. But breaking them means that people who need to use arrays in PHP 5 and PHP 7, and I hear a few people use arrays in PHP for the odd thing, really are going to be left out in the cold. And the problem is that even if you make little, seemingly insignificant cleanups, you end up with this problem. So this is the Python 3 readiness page. And what it tracks is the number of libraries that work on Python 3, the number of the top 360 PyPy libraries that work on Python 3. Now, Python 3 was released 6.5 years ago, just for the record. It's still only at 290 out of 360. Now, some of those have good reasons. A few, I presume, have probably been abandoned. Some have native code that maybe didn't port as easily as others. I'm not saying that you expect to be at 360, but that's a really low number. That's kind of depressing. And the part that I tried to find a historical graph of this, and the site doesn't publish it, unfortunately. The real problem is that Python has gotten, I think now, 4 minor versions in. And probably a year ago, that was half that number. So what that really meant was, even though the Python language team were up on stage, much as I am today, and Zev was yesterday, saying, hey, you should use the new shiny, it's really shiny, it's got all this shininess. they haven't been able to get users to move because people just go, yeah, but I need Django. Like, my website relies on Django. What do I do? So I think the PHP team has done a somewhat better job than the Python team, and to be honest, I think this is mostly because we learned from what Python had done in terms of maintaining and maximizing that surface area. So now I'm going to undermine the entire premise of my talk because I'm going to pop up a tweet from Lorna the other day, which is that the number of changes required to make the join-in API work on PHP 7 was 0. So this is great news. For a lot of people and a lot of websites, basically what this is saying is you may just be able to move. You know, this is awesome. You know, you can move up at some point, you can move aggressively if you're a website and other people, you know, you're not a downstream project, upstream project, whichever way it is. You know, you can basically move and your code will still work, and that's great. Of course, the world is not quite that rosy, and we're going to go into some things that probably will break for some people and will definitely break for some people, but you might get lucky. So that's what you can do. I've kind of touched on this already. What should you do? Depends on who you are. If you're a library author, like I said, I think you have to support both, but I think there's a much more important thing than supporting both PHP 5 and PHP 7. The much more important thing is telling your users, develop a support policy, put it in GitHub, like put a markdown page, just support.md, I don't know, there's probably a standard name for this. Sebastian, is there a standard name for this?
I don't know, but I have a document like that for PHP unit.
There you go, PHP unit already has a document like this. You obviously have documentation somewhere, right? Otherwise people aren't using your library. So, or framework, as the case may be. So support both versions for a reasonable period, but come up with a schedule. You know, say, okay, on January 1st, 2017, we're going to drop PHP 5.4 and 5.5 support. On January 1st, 2018, we're going to drop 5.6 support. And on January 2nd, 2018, all those pull requests that we've had queuing up for 2 years to use all the awesome shininess of PHP 7 will get merged. By the way, it could be pretty unstable. You know, do something like that, but the most important thing is you've got to communicate. Tell your users so that they know what to expect. So for library users, which is, I would suspect, every single person in this room, look for those support policies. Hopefully they will get written. Now, as I said, you can kind of either have a flag day or you can support both for a period of time. I would suggest supporting both just from the point of view of it gives you more diversity of environments. If you're running automated tests, that gives you a really good way of kind of seeing how things go over a period of time. And if you're in a team environment or an environment where you have a larger deployment, you really don't have much of a choice. You're not going to get everybody to switch over at 9 o'clock in the morning on, you know, January 1st. There's going to be people who, you know, you'll have developers, probably mostly in this room, who will want to go ahead as soon as possible. You'll have people who will want to stay behind as long as possible. So you're probably going to have to support both. What this may mean is that if libraries, for whatever reason, if a library you depend on doesn't support PHP 7, it breaks for some reason, I would suggest the very best thing you can do is fix it and issue a pull request. Now, fixing it's one part of the problem. The pull request is actually the more important part of the problem, because you don't want to end up in a situation where you're supporting your own branch of something that you depend upon for any real length of time. Like, it's okay for a month or two, that's fine, you can kind of manage that. But you don't want to be doing it for years. I've done it, it is miserable. It is horrible. You have to figure out how to integrate patches from upstream. You have to integrate your own patches. You will probably break stuff. Your rebases will become messy. Just don't do it. Like, put a pull request in, bribe the author of the library at a conference with beer to accept your pull request. If you ply them enough, they'll accept anything. Trust me, that's how I became a PHP contributor. So get them upstream. So the methods that you can use, I guess, to verify that you're doing okay on PHP 5 and PHP 7, well, there's no substitute for tests. If you don't have tests, start writing tests, because these are the things that will actually tell you when stuff is broken. You know, there's a lot of subtle, insidious BC breaks, which I'm going to cover. And they're not too scary, they're pretty uncommon, but they're there. And some of them, literally, the only way you're ever going to know is either by testing, or you can have your users tell you. I generally don't like my users being the first people to notice that my site is down. I don't know about you guys and gals. So, you know, this is the biggest weapon you have. Now, what you need to do in addition to this is not just test, but you need to make sure you're actually testing thoroughly. Now, Xdebug has code coverage. We saw that awesome branch coverage thing that, well, those who were in Derek's talk yesterday saw the awesome branch coverage thing. I'm told Sebastian already has that implemented and fully working. He is shaking his head and laughing. But it's going to be there soon. And the point is that's how you actually verify that things aren't going to break, by actually testing the stuffing out of your code. I suspect there will be some tooling, and this is mostly because I'm writing some tooling, but I think there'll be some automated code scanners. I think there'll be some stuff that will appear in the next few months that you can also use to detect some of these patterns. It's not going to catch everything, and that's why testing is so important. Perhaps the most important thing, though, and this is something that we always tend to preach on IRC when people come for help with PHP, is try stuff. Like set up one of your, if you've got a staging server that runs PHP 5, clone it, put PHP 7 on it, put your code on it, see what happens. Maybe it falls over horribly in a screaming fire. Maybe it works perfectly like joined in did. But the point is, the test will tell you if something's not working, but to some extent the only way that you're going to know end to end if things are working is if you set something up and try it. You've got to use these techniques hand in hand. And make sure you set the error reporting to EAL, please, and log them somewhere or display them or do something so that you actually know what's going to break in 7.1, 7.2, 8.0, etc. So what actually is broken? I'm going to talk mostly about breaks that are going to occur that are silent. Now there's lots and lots of breaks in PHP 7. Well, okay, lots and lots sounds really dramatic. There are a number of breaks in PHP 7 that will jump up and down wildly and will tell you that it's broken and what you need to do. And if they don't tell you what they need to do, can you please send a pull request to improve the error message, because that sucks. But there are some breaks that are subtle and are going to break without you necessarily knowing, particularly if you don't have 100% code coverage or 100% branch coverage, or at least a reasonable code coverage level. So I'm going to go through them, I'm going to describe what they are, we're going to talk about how you can fix them, and we're going to talk about how you can find them. So this one doesn't seem dramatic at all. Variable handling. How important is that? It's both better and worse than you think. What it's really about is indirect references, and it's a specific type of indirect reference that's changed semantics. It's basically these four. There's actually really only three. The middle two are basically versions of the same thing. So these have all changed behaviour in PHP 7, and I'll show you what I mean by changed behaviour, and I'll break down what that means in a minute. I guess the first question though is, why are we inflicting this pain on you? The humble PHP developer. The reason is that there's a lot more awesome syntax that's going to come in PHP 7, because Nikita Popov, in conjunction with a few other people, wrote an awesome new abstract syntax tree based parser for PHP, and now we can support things like, hey, maybe you want two I'm not even going to say it, double colon things in the same expression. The ones I'm particularly excited about are the fact that you can now do the JavaScripty thing of defining a closure and immediately calling it. So if you want a poor man's or poor woman's lexical scope, you can now do it. And you can actually, if you have a closure that is an object property, you can now directly call it without having to assign it to an intermediate variable if you put parentheses around it. This is pretty cool. So this is actually why why these changes are in. So these are awesome. This is great. Good work, Nikita. But there is some pain. Now, there's not much pain. In the RFC, Nikita actually looked at a bunch of frameworks and libraries, and for example, Zen Framework and Symfony, between them only had one problem caused by this change. That change was actually in Doctrine. It was one of the underlying libraries. So that's good. It's probably one of those things that's pretty minor, but you just don't get any warning. Like, you might get an error if what you're referencing isn't the right type, but it's really subtle. So I'm just going to quickly break these down. So the first example here, this is using variables. So if you're using variables, you've probably lost anyway. But just in case you haven't, what this does in PHP 5 is it takes the array value of this two-dimensional array and then uses that as a variable name. In PHP 7, what it does instead is it uses foo as the variable name and then tries to dereference an array. Now, in a lot of cases this will error because the thing that you're pointing to indirectly with foo probably isn't an array, but if it is, then you are going to get some really weird results. So that one's something to be aware of. The next one was property access dynamic property access to an array. So in PHP 5, that's treated as the name of the property, bar baz. In PHP 7, it's the other way around. The associativity has changed. So it becomes foo bar is the array that you're going to, so the bar property of the foo object is the array, and then you're looking for the baz. This is also basically the same thing as the third variation I showed earlier. It's just that was making a method call immediately afterwards. So that one's a little bit more common. I think the one that's probably the most common is going to be this one, but it's a very specific scenario. So this is, in PHP 5, we are accessing the bar static property on the foo class, which is an array, so we're accessing baz, and that's apparently callable, so we're going to call it. In PHP 7, as you would probably expect if you've been paying attention, because they're all pretty much variations on the same theme, you now take the bar property of foo, which you expect to be an array, and call it. Now the odds are that this is incompatible because, you know, chances are it can't be both. So you probably are okay on this one. It will probably error out, but I think it's also the only one that's actually likely to happen for most people in practice. This was the one that was in Doctrine Common. So what do you do? Say you find some of these. What do you do? Well, let's just pick an example. So, as I said, if this is the most common one, you can use curly braces. All the examples I just showed for PHP 7 and PHP 5 are valid syntax. You can actually feed those into the parser and you'll get consistent behaviour on both versions. So you can use curly braces and parentheses to preserve the existing behaviour. What I would do, to be honest though, is I just turn it into 2 lines. Like, I don't really want to think about that. I would rather just have it be clear. Variables are cheap. You know, it's a few extra keystrokes, maybe a couple of extra cycles. So what I would say is just break it down, set a variable, and then just call it. The tricky bit is, what do I look for? Because if you're not getting error messages or warnings, then this just became a fair bit harder to find. I think there are 2 lines of defense on this one. It turns out that about 90% of people here apparently use PHP Storm, so my suspicion is that at some point PHP Storm will actually include some sort of detection for this. You can also use for those of you like me who are Vim hackers, you can also use a slightly more general approach. Please don't copy this down. I will tweet it after the talk if you really desperately want it, and the slides will be available. This isn't perfect, it doesn't catch non-ASCII variable names, you know, so if you're using emoji in your variables, sorry. But it will probably catch most sins. This will at least give you some idea of where to look. As I said, this is, in some respects, the headline BC break. And honestly, if this is the headline BC break, then we're in pretty good shape. You know, this isn't exactly a huge problem, but it's still something you're going to have to be aware of. If you have a big, old, object-oriented code base from the early days of PHP 5, it might get you. You need to be aware of it. Probably the other big one is that a lot of errors in PHP 5 have become exceptions. So PHP has a long and sorted history with exceptions. In PHP 4 there were no exceptions and the world was good. In PHP 5 there are exceptions and people use them very liberally and sometimes for control flow, which is a very bad idea. Maybe not quite as bad as GoTo, but it's still pretty bad. And that's great, but nothing or very little in PHP throws an exception. You know, in the language itself and the runtime, there aren't a lot of things that actually throw exceptions. This obviously seems a little bit weird because what it means is that you have this very hard dichotomy between the concept of an error in PHP and the concept of an exception in PHP, and you have to handle them in very different ways. And the ways in which you handle them differ in detail too. You know, if you have an error handler set up that receives a recoverable error, if you continue execution, it goes right back to the line where the error was generated. You know, you can't treat it like a catch block. It actually goes right back. If you throw an exception, obviously the try block ends and you go into a catch block, or you go to the default exception handler. So in PHP 7, the runtime will throw errors for a lot of things that were previously unrecoverable. So in PHP 5, this is the number of each type of error. This doesn't really reflect necessarily how often you'll see them, but this is a number of each type. So 182 fatals, 17 recoverables, 1 parse error. Who knew about eParse? I mean, I didn't even know they existed. PHP 7 reduces these significantly. Almost all the recoverables are gone, most of the fatals are gone, and the eParse is gone. So this is good. I mean, this gives you more control over how you actually deal with errors, how you catch errors, and actually gives you the opportunity in 128 cases to catch the error. like regardless of the mechanism that's used. That's a good thing because it's the difference between showing a 500 internal server error to a user and actually being able to show a friendly page with helpful information and something that theoretically could still be dynamic. You know, okay, you can show a friendly 500. I mean, Twitter obviously had the fail whale, right? But being able to show a dynamic 500, log more stuff is great. Maybe send an alert. You know, you can do what you need to. So let's look at an example of this in practice. So this is using PHP 7's new scalar type syntax. So we've got a very basic function that squares a couple of integers you give it. I don't know why I picked int, it could have been float, I guess. But whatever happens, we're going to give it a string, and something that's really not a numeric string, like something that's just straight up letters. So what happens when we call this in PHP 7? Well, you get an uncaught exception. In this case, uncaught type error, argument 1 must be of type integer, string given. Now, I have to put a caveat in here. This is not actually the literal error message you will get today from PHP 7. And the reason for that is because this is actually called type exception. There is an ongoing discussion thread on internals right now about whether to rename some of this before the first alpha release. I suspect it will be renamed. This is why I'm using the new names on the slides. I have not caught up on my internals email from last night, so if this has changed in the last 12 hours, I'm really sorry. The point is there's going to be something that's called type, and it's going to have either the word error or exception after it. So what that means, because it's an exception rather than an error, is that we can catch this. Like it's a normal try-catch block. This isn't something using setErrorHandler. This is just us going, hey, we're going to recover gracefully. You know, the case where you use this a lot in, say, Python, which is where I have mostly used this, is that you're getting data from maybe an arbitrary source, maybe JSON or something like that. You may not know exactly what's coming in. Now, theoretically, of course, you should actually validate the data on the way in, but let's say you haven't because reasons. In this case, this gives you a chance to at least have a second chance. You know, you can take this and you can, in actual fact, recover gracefully, show a graceful error, do whatever you need to. Now, the way this has been implemented is by changing the exception hierarchy in PHP 7. In PHP 5, it's a very simple hierarchy. We have this exception object, which is the top level. There are some other exceptions that you can basically use in your own code, like logic exception, runtime exception. They've got children as well. But the point is basically that exception is the top level. In PHP 7, the top level has changed. Exceptions move down a level. The top level object, so at the moment this is called base exception. It will probably be called throwable by the time there's an alpha release because that more matches what other languages do. And then under that you're going to have two hierarchies. You're going to have exception, you're going to have error. The reason for this is because of this construct, the Pokemon handler. Got to catch them all. In PHP 5, if you do this, you know to a reasonable extent that you're never going to get something that's not a user-generated exception. Like, with very few exceptions, oh, sorry, that wasn't meant to be a pun. In very few cases will it be something that's been generated from the engine. In most cases, it's going to be something that you did, and therefore you can catch it, you kind of know what it is. Which means that you have a finite set of cases where you might actually get an exception. Now, if these errors were under the exception hierarchy, then those number of cases just exploded, and that's probably bad. So what this means you can do in PHP 7 is you can change your Pokemon blocks to catch throwable. I don't know that's a very good idea. It's probably quite a bad idea in actual fact in most cases, but hey, the option's there. But Adam, what do I do? Well, there is a friend here who can help you, and that is setExceptionHandler. So setExceptionHandler is to exceptions what setErrorHandler is to errors. It's in PHP 5 as well. I'm sure a lot of you have used it. So this is for any exception that's not caught, basically. If you throw an exception and it's not caught somewhere in your call stack and it bubbles all the way back up to the top, then the exception handler will get called. So what I would do, let's say you've got this set up in PHP 5. You've got setErrorHandler for errors, and you've got maybe a Pokemon block in your front controller or something like that to catch all user land exceptions. What that then means is that in PHP 7, you can then use setExceptionHandler to basically get the things that you weren't catching before. And that then means that you can probably do similar things to what you were doing in set error handling. You know, show the user a friendly page, log what happened, maybe page someone if it's on a critical page or something like that, send something to your monitoring service, whatever the case may be. The important thing is you can do this and basically write code that will work consistently on both. Now, this doesn't catch everything. There are times where you're genuinely going to have to catch an error. For example, this is basically a very simplified version of a bug in PhD, which builds the PHP documentation that I found yesterday. If you give highlight string something that's now invalid in PHP 7, and invalid octal strings now actually generate parse errors, thank God, you will now get a parse error. So in this case, what this allowed me to do was, so what we do in PhD is we basically for code samples run them through highlight string so that you get that nice highlighted stuff in the manual. All the examples get highlighted. But what that actually does behind the scenes is PHP actually parses it. Like it actually goes through the normal PHP parser. So if that happens in PHP 5, and we've done this before, where you commit an example to the PHP documentation that is syntactically invalid, then the documentation doesn't build. This is a problem. So what we can now do in PhD is we can catch this parse error and say, hey, we'll just, instead of trying to highlight this and putting that in the HTML, why don't we just put it in a pre-tag and just put it in the HTML? At least something still happens. And we can log a warning and then somebody can maybe look at it in 5 years. There is, to be fair, an additional wrinkle. Now, for those of you who are, that really wasn't the button I meant to hit. For those of you who are using setExceptionHandler, the example in the PHP documentation doesn't actually tell you to do this, but it very strongly implies that you might want to type hint your exception handler to take exception. It doesn't actually mean to imply that, but it's just the way we document prototypes really makes it look like that's a good idea. So in PHP 7, of course, you might get things that aren't actually exceptions. So what will happen is an exception, and say you've got an error exception, it bubbles up to the top level, your handle looks like this, you then get another error which says, hey, this doesn't match the type hint. Unfortunately, there's code in the Zend engine to actually prevent that from propagating, because I was really hoping I could just get a chain of exceptions that basically said that, but no, apparently they thought of that. So in PHP 7, if you've got a type hint, you would have to have it say throwable. The problem, of course, is that throwable doesn't exist in PHP 5. So if you make this your exception handler in PHP 5, you'll get type errors because exceptions don't match the type hint. There are a couple of ways you can deal with this. I mean, you could probably use class alias if you really wanted to. Don't. But the way I deal with it is just get rid of the type hint. If this callable is something that you register with setExceptionHandler and never ever call again, PHP will send you the right thing. If PHP sends you sends an exception handler a parameter, PHP believes it is a valid exception. So this is probably a situation where you don't actually have to type in. What do I look for? I would just check whatever your exception handler is or are. If you have multiple exception handlers, just make sure they're not type hinted, make sure they're doing the right thing, and check your Pokemon blocks. Like, have a look at where they are, see if they need to catch throwables, see if they should really just be catching exceptions. Perhaps most importantly, see if you can actually just cut them down and make them more specific. Like, see if you can just catch a specific exception. You know, if you know that you're always going to throw a foo exception because everything inherits from that in your module, then just catch a foo exception. Let other modules, let other callers figure out what to do if you throw something else. As part of my ongoing commitment to overly BuzzFeedy, fear-mongering slide titles, the next one is called for each. How is for each broken? Let me count the ways. There aren't very many. They're both pretty obscure. They're both things that I would say were probably undefined behaviour anyway in PHP 5. I didn't actually go all the way back to the spec to double check this, but I'm pretty sure they are theoretically undefined behaviour. But of course, people will still rely on them. They're both to do with by reference for each. Spoiler alert. So the first one is, if you change an array while you're iterating over it in a for each, by reference for each, sorry, the terminology gets really tricky here. different things will happen. In PHP 5, in this case, you only get the first element. The element that you've just pushed doesn't appear in this for each execution. In PHP 7, surprise, it does. Now, this isn't really a bad change. I think you could argue that it's probably better behavior than the previous version. It's certainly actually less surprising, but it is different. So that's something you have to account for. Who knows what these functions are? Few of you are raising hands. You are apparently all as old as I am. So in PHP 3, this was how you did iteration over arrays. You didn't have for each. You set up for loops with basically these functions and stuff happened. So in PHP 5, if you are for eaching over an array by reference, it actually alters the same internal array pointer that you use with those functions. So what that means is that in your loop bodies, you can actually call current and you actually get the next value for reasons. This is bizarre. I have great difficulty imagining that anybody actually intentionally relies on this, but I bet at least somebody out there relies on this unintentionally. In PHP 7, it doesn't change the internal array pointer, so what that means is you always get the first one, assuming you haven't previously done something to manipulate it. This is probably a little more consistent, probably a little better, and is really going to cause a weird bug for some maintenance programmer out there on a really old system. So what do you do? Well, in this situation, don't use the old array iteration functions. This is probably pretty good advice for life in general. Use array walk or array map instead of reference for eaches. You know, if you're not actually adding or removing elements to your array in your for each, and seriously, it's a bad idea. Don't do that. Then you can use array walk and array map to manipulate your array in place, particularly array walk, of course, because it's actually on your actual array. The nice thing is, one of the often reported bugs that we get in PHP is people using $v after the loop. So if you've done it by reference, you use $v after the loop, then you get spooky action at a distance because it's still a reference to the last element in the array you looked at. So weird things happen. If you use array walk or array map, then you don't have that problem. You effectively have simulated lexical scope because you're going into a separate function. That's great. So use them anyway. Use them often. I do. And finally, if you are in a position where you have to change array element, or the actual number of elements in the array while you're iterating over it by reference, this is going to sound like the least helpful advice ever. Just don't do that. Don't. Don't. Come up with a better way of doing this, because otherwise you are going to get behavior that is inconsistent between PHP 5 and PHP 7, and you've just chosen that you're going to have a flag day, or never migrate to PHP 7 and be like the guy on the beach. Both of those are bad options, so don't do it. What am I looking for? Since I've just come up with basically a passionate explanation of why you shouldn't use by reference for each, look for your by reference for eaches. That's pretty much the easiest way to figure that out. So I'm going to rip through a few more changes. These are smaller. We're going to get through them pretty fast. Hex strings are no longer considered to be numeric. So in PHP 5, you can give a string with 0x something to something that expects integers, and it will work. You get 256 out the other side. Yay! In PHP 7, you don't. It's treated like a normal string to integer conversion, which is already kind of weird, which is basically that if it starts with a number and then there's something that's not a number, then it will stop parsing at that number and it won't generate a warning. I am sorry to say there still isn't a warning in this case. So this is still silent, but at the very least you get 0 instead. What do I do about this? I'd say the real answer is don't be in a situation where you don't know if you're expecting a hex string or a decimal numeric string. Like, that's probably bad. If you know you're expecting a hex string, then you can use scanf or you can use hexdec with some pre-processing to basically convert that into a number, and then you can call square with an actual number. Like, that's probably the best way to do it. As I said, if you don't know what you're getting, maybe you're writing, I don't know, a calculator, something like that. Maybe you put a mode switch in so you do know what you're getting, because not knowing what your inputs are is obviously, as I'm sure we all know, one of the biggest sources of PHP bugs. So try to know what your inputs actually are and what you're expecting. What do I look for this? How do I find this? Well, for the simple case, which was I've got a string literal, it's pretty simple. You look for the string literal. In the general case where you're accepting user input, I don't know what to tell you. Like, there are no warnings associated with this. If you have good tests, then hopefully you have a test that will cover this and you might actually pick this up. But if you have users who are relying on this behavior just totally by accident and you don't know about it, you're pretty much only going to know by the bug reports. I'm very sorry. That one's a nasty one. This one is really obscure, but I'm still mentioning it because it's silent. I didn't even know this worked until 2 days ago, for the record. So if you pass a string, but not a string literal, only a string variable, into list and unpack it, you will actually get each character. And this is part of PHP's former pretense when it was a much thinner layer over C, that strings are kind of like C arrays, except for all the ways in which they're not in PHP. And there's a lot of them. So you could theoretically use this to unpack a string. As I said, I still don't get why this didn't support literals. Like, I actually went to 3v4l.org and tried to figure out if that was ever supported, and apparently it wasn't. Weird. In PHP 7 you get nulls because it's not an array. The problem is that you don't get a warning, which I find actually kind of odd now I'm up here talking about it. Maybe we should have a warning, but right now it's silent. What do I do? Well, you can just use string split to turn it into an actual array and stuff comes out the other end. What do I look for? I would say just look for, on most code bases you don't tend to use list a lot. Like, it's one of those constructs that's incredibly handy in the couple of cases where you know you need it, but it's something that you don't tend to use a ton. So just look at all your lists. If you have a code base where you have hundreds of lists, this may be somewhat less practical. You may have other issues. But in that, what you're looking for basically is, if you look at the list, is there a situation in which you will not have an array going into that list statement? Is there a situation where you'll unpack something that's not an array? If you know that there's not, then you are good. And you can also use array type hints to maybe control that. Yield. Man, we only just added yield 2 years ago. How could this have changed already? Well, as part of the parser improvements, the associativity has changed. So if you have a really ill-advised construct like this, yield foo or bar, or yield foo or die, which was actually the example in the RFC, then it's treated like this. You get a boolean out the other end, and that gets yielded back up. In PHP 7, it now binds more tightly, so you'll get yield foo, and then there's an expression at the end, which is or bar. This does actually open up the very popular yield foo or die pattern. I don't really recommend that, but hey, it's your code. What do I do? Just use parentheses. I mean, you know what you want, just pick the one that actually matches what you want. That one's pretty easy. What do I look for? I think realistically, given that yield is probably one of those things that, again, most code bases only use in a very small number of places, you can probably just look at all your yield statements for this. In 99% of cases, those statements are probably just going to be straight up variables. So that's fine. You don't have to do anything. Party on. Another very overly dramatic title, sorting. PHP has never guaranteed a stable sort. So a stable sort is when you sort something, when you sort an array or whatever collection you have, and you have elements that are equal, a stable sort will keep them in the same order, guaranteed. PHP does not guarantee this. There is, I think, a warning block on the sort page saying that PHP doesn't guarantee this. In actual fact, in PHP 5, it will do the exact opposite. The order always gets swapped. So it's actually the most unstable sort possible. In PHP 7, it is more stable, which is actually a quote from the original email from Shingen, but it's not actually stable. So basically the same prohibitions apply in terms of it's not a stable sort. The reason this change was made is because the new sorting algorithm is just a little bit quicker. So this is good. If you're sorting arrays with 10,000 elements, this is great. What do I do about it? I think the only place this is likely to come up for most people is in overly specific test cases. So where you've written code in PHP unit that goes assert equal to, or assert equal to, or assert identical to, and you've given it an actual array of literals in order. So if this comes up, then just, you'll know because your tests fail, basically. Like what you're looking for as test failures. If you have code that depends on this behavior, I would argue that this code is broken. Like I said, PHP does not guarantee the stability of a sort. So if you were relying on the existing so in PHP 5, I guess the behavior was consistent but unstable, consistently unstable. Like you knew what order you were going to get stuff in, it just didn't necessarily make sense. Well, you still know what order you're going to get stuff in, but it might be different and it still doesn't make sense. Welcome to PHP. The very last thing I'm going to talk about in terms of silent insidious breaks is our old friend date time zone. We've all seen this, probably lots and lots of times, probably every single time we set up a build slave or a vagrant box or something like that. In PHP 7, this becomes that. There is no longer an error message generated on startup if you do not have a date time zone set and then use a date function. I personally actually think this is a really bad idea, but it got voted in, so here I am talking about it. Woo! What this means in practice, PHP will not auto-detect your system time zone because auto-detecting system time zones is actually impossible on some operating systems. Windows. So instead, what PHP will do is it will pick UTC for you. I would incredibly strongly advise you to still set an explicit time zone in php.ini or using default set time zone, because if you do not, you get UTC, that may be what you expect. I mean, sensible people run their servers in UTC anyway, so it might be okay. But the moment you move your code base to a shitty shared server that somebody set up in America who hasn't heard of UTC or anything outside of America, it will probably break. Don't do that. Okay, so that's all the things that won't scream at you. I'm going to talk really briefly about 4 things that will scream at you, but I think are going to affect most people. The first thing is, all of these you can no longer use as class names, or interface names, or trait names, because they're required for scalar type declarations. You want scalar type declarations, this is the flip side. You don't get to use these. This is one of those things that is incredibly painful if you have a very large set of assertion classes, Sebastian, and probably not super painful for most other people. Maybe if you have classes that wrap primitive types for things like validation or something like that. The nice thing is that at least this will scream at you really loudly if you do this. There is a very specific error message that tells you exactly what you've done. You also can't use these names in namespace classes, so just be aware of that. I would probably also, they're not actually reserved yet, I would probably avoid scalar and void as well, because I think at some point in the future probably one or both of them will be added to that list. So just don't call your classes scalar or void. In PHP 5.6 we told you HTTP raw post data was going away. It's gone. Don't use it. You can access it through the PHP input stream, which you can treat like a file. So that's nice. EXT, the original MySQL extension is actually really gone. It is. Thank you. I did actually make that commit. It's actually the thing I'm most proud of in the entirety of PHP. Every single commit I've pushed. It's gone, use MySQLi or PDO MySQL. Of course, nobody in this room was using this anyway, right? Right. And finally, and this really isn't a big problem, but I just found it so funny that you could do this, I had to put it up on a slide. You used to be able to use variable variables with the global statement. You could actually pull in dynamically global variables into your scope. You can't do that anymore. I really hope that doesn't break anyone's code. So, when can you have all of this goodness? And by goodness I mean badness, but at least start finding out what badness you have in your code. Well, the answer is you can basically have it yesterday. You can get actual code right now from Zend have some repositories for common distributions. Rasmus now has a Vagrant image that's actually now like 3 months out of date, unfortunately, so that's kind of sad. There are ways to get it right now. You can also build it yourself. PHP 7 hasn't really changed any build dependencies from PHP 5. In actual fact, it's removed a couple. So if you can build PHP 5, or you can find a recent guide for building PHP 5 on your operating system or distribution, whatever it says is exactly the same in PHP 7. Just remember to change all the 5s to 7s when you're setting up the configuration. It will work. You can build it. It's not that hard. Of course, if you don't want to do that, or you have sysadmin policies that say that you can't do that, pretty soon there's going to be an alpha release. And by pretty soon, I mean think days or weeks, not months. Once that happens, I think the usual people who distribute packages like Andre for Debian, Remy Collet for Red Hat and CentOS will probably start setting up their own repos with those alpha packages. And if they don't, I'm sure somebody else will. So you will be able to get reasonably official packages really soon. I mean, this will probably be in Debian experimental really soon. Finally, there had to be one cute picture. Finally, remember that turnabout is fair play. In this presentation, I've talked about how you migrate your code, how you have it run on both PHP 5 and 7, or how you have a flag day and you change over. But remember, whenever you're running code on PHP 7, you're helping us test. You know, we haven't had an alpha yet. We're a fair way off in terms of a final release. There's a lot of code paths that haven't been tested. Chances are, particularly if you get on this today, you'll probably find a bug. Like, there's a lot of new code. You probably will find a bug. We're not that good. So if you do find a bug, be amazing. Report the bugs on bugs.php.net. If you have C skills and you think you can fix it, send a pull request. If you don't have C skills, but you can reproduce it very reliably, write a test case. There is information, there are links on how you can actually do this in the very new contributing.md file in PHP source master. So if you find bugs, please help us. We want to deliver the most amazing PHP 7.0.0 ever. We want to deliver a stable release, 0.0 release that actually is stable. History's against us, but let's just, it's a nice goal. So help us. Give us your bug reports, try your code, see what breaks, and we'll all win. And with that, I open up the floor to questions. Oh, and the link for the slides, which is here, is not actually live yet because I have terrible internet here and haven't pushed to GitHub yet. It will be live at some point during the day. I will tweet when it's up. Yo.
The 4-H examples that you were giving, does that only affect if you're doing it by reference on the value?
So the question was, do the 4-H examples only affect if you're doing it by reference? The answer is yes. It doesn't affect what I would call normal operation of 4-H.
Normally it increments the pointer, right, when it goes through. So would this affect people who are implementing iterators and things like that?
It shouldn't affect people implementing iterators because I think that would have been fairly interestingly broken to start with. I think the difference with iterators is there won't be a behavioural change. Like it may, because iterators have less abstraction between the underlying pointer because you're managing it within the object and the loop, I think you'll find there's no behavioural change just because it's more closely tied to the object anyway. So yeah, I mean, I guess I should have made that clearer. Those examples really would just be for arrays. Objects shouldn't change, but I also can't claim I've tested it very thoroughly, so they might. If they do, can you file a bug? All right. There being no other questions, please rate this talk on Joined In, as I'm sure everybody will tell you, and thank you very much.